preface this, I want to say that last year I spent about 32 days in the woods, either scouting, hunting, or fishing. The year before that, I spent about 22 days. This doesn't include my regular hunts and camping adventures, which in the past 3 years adds up to just over 100 days. I've been hunting since I was 9 and have spent a lot of time outdoors in various different parts of the US and in Canada. I've seen and heard a lot of strange shit, but this one takes the cake. I was in Cohutta, North Georgia wilderness, for 7 days scouting bears, wild hogs, and deers, prepping for a hunting trip later that year. I was hiked in about 10 miles, and then went off trail for another 3 to 5 miles. Basically, I was out in the middle of nowhere. Since I was alone, I was using a hammock that had a built-in bug net, and I had a rainy fly over it. I spent about 3 days halfway up the mountain, just looking for a good place to hunt. I saw 3 or 4 good-sized bears, about 10 hogs, and came across some good-sized deer. On the 4th day, I was going to head down to the small stream that I had marked on my GPS, and then set up camp, restock water, and prep for a 2-day hike back. I could go faster, but I wanted to be able to look for any animal signs along the way. As I approached this small stream, I noticed a tent, which I was excited to see, as I had been completely alone for a few days, and it's always nice to run into another hiker. Generally, us wilderness folks are pretty down to earth. As I got closer to the tent, I noticed that there was a small pack on the ground just outside of it. I figured the person couldn't have gone far from where the camp was, so I set up my camp about 30 yards away, and with about 4 hours of daylight left, started cooking some dinner. 2 hours later, I was starting to wonder where this person was. Given that I was in the wilderness, it was a 1+ day hike out. There wasn't much I could do, but I did hike around the site, making a circle as I went out to look for any signs of a struggle, in case of a bear attack, or maybe they had an injury. I got about a 1/4 mile from the campsite and walked a circle, but I didn't find anything. As night came, no one showed. I started a fire, in hopes that the person would be able to find where they had set up, and have some light. Fire burns really bright, and is very easy to see from far away. After eating, searching, and hoping that the person was going to make it back, I called it a night. I had a small flask with me and took a couple of sips of whiskey, jumped into my hammock with my pistol, and attempted to go to sleep. I sleep pretty hard. I mean, really hard, regardless of where I am. It literally annoys my friends, because I can always fall asleep, and stay asleep, regardless of where in the world I am. But this night was different. I felt like something was off, but I figured it was just me worrying about this person, who, by all accounts, was completely missing. So, for the first time in my life, I woke up to the sound of what I thought was footsteps, but not in the sense of footsteps on leaves, but what a heavy-footed person would make walking on an old wooden floor. It was extremely loud. I got my gun, grabbed my headlamp stored in a small compartment above me, and waited to see if it would stop. Right at the moment it did. Then I saw something that scared the shit out of me. On my rainfly, the gleam of a flashlight. Faint, but there. I shouted, "Hello?" And right when I did, it sounded like 10 people suddenly running away from me in every direction. I dropped out of my hammock and onto the ground, frantically turning on my headlamp, shining it all around me. But I didn't see shit. My heart was racing pretty bad, but I thought it might have just been the reflection of the moon on the rainfly. Yeah, that was it. And those footsteps running away from me were probably armadillos, or something. Even though their eyes shine, and they're pretty easy to spot. The problem was, there was no moon, and I'd never seen an armadillo above 2,000 feet. Not to say that they don't live up there, just never seen one. And for some reason, the campsite I set up was gone. The fire had been put out by water. It was apparent because there was not a damn coal in that thing. I thought for sure it was about 4 a.m., but I had only gotten about an hour's sleep. At this point, I wanted to leave, but hiking out of the wilderness while it's dark is always a bad idea. So I grabbed my flask, took a swig of whiskey, removed my rainfly so I could see out of my hammock and around the area I was in, and tried my hardest to go back to sleep. I was laying down when I saw some light hit the trees above me. It was clear that it was coming from downstream, and I got out of my hammock and started yelling, "Hey, y'all need any help?" No response. I saw whatever was putting out the light, and it spun around and started heading downstream fast, really fast. At this point, my body had pumped through more adrenaline than it had blood, and I was exhausted from it all. I was finally able to fall asleep and woke up at around 7 a.m. When I did, I noticed that my water filter I had left out was missing. It's a gravity filter and it hangs on a tree, filtering water down into my main bladder that I put in my backpack. And my water bladder, sitting at the base of the tree, looked like it was cut down the middle with a knife. They had also cut down my bear bag, which had food in it, and took some of it. The creepiest part of it all was that they went through my bag, which was under my hammock, while I was sleeping. I checked the bear bag before I went back to sleep the second time, and it was there, hanging, and my bag under my hammock hadn't been touched. I packed all my shit and hightailed it out of there, keeping my pistol close to me and moving as fast as I could. I ended up making the hike back in just under 15 hours. I hiked the trail part in the night because I wasn't about to spend another night out there. I didn't see anyone on my hike out of there. Since then, I haven't gone out there without any friends. And lastly, I reported all of this to the local DNR, but they looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I am.
I was a kitchen manager at a 24-hour steak and shake, so generally I worked lunch and graveyard shifts. Usually, I'm alone on these shifts, but this night being a weekend, I had 2 other co-workers with me. My cashier and drive-thru person, Katie, was at the window doing a regular, "Hi, may I take your order?" sort of thing when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence and shot a glance over in my direction. Now, being the manager, I'm close by at all times, working the register in store and making the food. I walk over to see if she needs help or a manager code, and come to find out, it's a lady carrying a baby at our drive-thru window. She then asked, "Can you lend me a few dollars or some food? I'm trying to get money to stay in the motel across the street." My coworker looks to me and I say, "I'm sorry, but I'm not allowed to give away money or free food. We can call someone to pick you up if you'd like." The lady stares at my coworker and I before shaking her head no and walking off into the parking lot. I felt kind of bad because of the baby and it being winter, although there wasn't much snow, but wind was cutting through anything caught outdoors. A couple of hours go by and things seem pretty normal, so I decide to go out for a smoke. Just anything to get me away from the grill top. As I'm lighting up, I hear a disgruntled "No!" come from somewhere in the parking lot. Upon following the sound, I see, yet again, the same lady and child talking to a patron eating food in our parking lot. Assuming she is still asking for money, I start to walk over. She notices me and tries to walk away, but gives up on that attempt as I'm already cutting her off from the parking lot exit. Now, I'm not mad or creeped out, but it's company policy that we can't have people panhandling in the parking lot or harassing customers. I give her my manager spiel again and ask her to leave or the cops will have to be called. The whole time I'm outside, Katie is watching the events unfold from the drive-thru window. The lady stares me down, then mumbles something incoherently before forcefully pushing past me towards another vehicle that has just pulled up. I start to cut her off yet again when I hear 2 things. Katie saying hurry up and get back to the store in my headset, and the heavy rev of an engine in the distance. Katie is now talking lightning speed, something about, "Look, come back, hurry." As I'm reaching down to press the headset button to respond to Katie, I put everything together and my heart dropped. How could I be so dense? My eyes fell from the lady's face and moved to the child, and then it dawned on me. I hadn't heard it make a sound once, not even once. I start to back away slowly, still trying to keep my composure, and then I yell out, "Hey, I'm calling the fucking cops!" My assistant manager, Kevin, was taking out the garbage around back and saw a black SUV creeping up from behind our dumpsters, headed in my direction. The lady's eyes widened and then she bolted away from me, heading for the now speeding SUV, jumping into the passenger side and speeding off. Fortunately, they didn't get far. Katie had been listening in on the conversation I was having with the lady, and at the same time called the cops on her cell phone. She said that from the drive-thru light, you could clearly see the child's legs were hanging out of the many blankets it was wrapped in, and she swore that she saw that plastic hinge that fuses toys like that together, and immediately she figured that this was a scam. When the cops arrived, they told us that they weren't lying about the motel. They found the SUV parked in the back of the motel with the toy baby still inside. Turns out, They were junkies and have been assaulting late-night workers when they came out for the trash or whatever, and would either trick them with the lady and the baby or the man would rob you. It's not the scariest thing, but to know that I could have been a victim really puts me on edge.
I'm in foster care, and I recently moved into the basement of a house in a nicer neighborhood. Affluent area, big houses, not a lot of traffic. My room is in the basement of the house, and my view is into the backyard. There's a motion-activated light, but it only works occasionally. I'm an insomniac, so I'm always up way later than the couple I live with. It was around 3 a.m., so it was very dark outside, and I was in my room, playing the night away on my guitar. A little lamp was on, and I had a window cracked open. I'm not an anxious guy, but for some reason, I felt like something was off, like I was being watched. I brushed it off because the motion-activated light hadn't turned on, and I couldn't see anything or anyone in the thick darkness outside. At some point, I stopped playing and went to take a piss, and as I came back into my room, I noticed that it was way cooler than when I had left. Again, I brushed it off, until I saw that my window had been pushed open. There's a security chain on my window, but in my sleep-deprived idiocy, I just wrote it off as my cat coming inside to eat while I went to the bathroom. Before I moved in where I live now, I lived in a seedy, high-crime area, so I'm always hyper-alert at night. I went to take a look just to be safe, and that's when I saw it. There was a person a few meters from my open window. Now, I'm not a big guy, but I've been in my fair share of fistfights and physical arguments, so I wasn't really worried about him messing me up. He obviously knew I'd spotted him, as we had eye contact before I sprinted for the window. I got there a little before him, but he somehow managed to get his fingers inside before I slammed the window down on his fingers with all my might, hearing a horrible crack as the heavy window hit his hand. He didn't try to retract his hand or say anything at first, but when I cracked it open to do it again, he quickly pulled away and yelped in pain. I secured the windows, and he stood there with his bleeding hand held close to his body with his eyes firmly locked with mine for 10 seconds or so, before he ran off in the direction of the front of the house. I ran upstairs as quickly as I could, but he was nowhere to be seen. I woke up the couple, but not before I checked all windows and doors. They called the police while I checked everything again and turned on the lights in the house. The police took swabs of the blood on my window frame, but it didn't match anything in their system, and no one went to the hospital within a 100-kilometer radius with matching injuries the following 5 days. To this day, I don't know who the hell tried to break in, or if he's still around. The thing that bothers me the most is that he didn't run away when I first spotted him, and I don't know how long he'd been out there, lurking, spying on me in the darkness.
My story takes place almost 20 years ago, when I was a little girl. I was 10 years old and my parents left me home alone for the afternoon. It was Saturday, so I decided to invite my 9-year-old cousin and best friend to keep me company. My childhood was located deep in the country, in a heavily forested area, and our closest neighbor was at least a mile away. It was around 3 p.m., and we were playing with our Barbies when we noticed, through the large living room window, a red car enter the driveway. I had never seen that car before. We waited a couple of minutes in silence, when suddenly, there were loud knocks at the front door. They sounded aggressive, and I had a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I tiptoed down the first few steps, peeked out the door and saw a stranger's face looking back at me through the adjacent window. I jumped back and told my cousin to hide. The knocks got more aggressive and the man started to pull hard on the door handle. I was noticing the handle getting looser, almost breaking. So my cousin and I ran up the stairs to my parents' bedroom, the only room in the house with a lock, and we hid. I took the phone and called my father. No answer. The noise stopped. As we attempted to leave the bedroom, the knocking started up again. This time, someone was at our back porch trying to break down the sliding glass doors, which had 2 separate locks, thankfully. We hurried back into the room and we both tried to call our fathers. No answer. I couldn't call the police since I didn't know their number. In the 90s, 911 hadn't made it to our country village yet. My mother had left the police's 7-digit phone number on the kitchen counter, but that was where the sliding glass doors were, and I wasn't about to face that man again. The noise stopped once more, so we tiptoed down the stairs and made our way to the living room. We heard a car start and leave the driveway. Relieved, we made our way to the largest living room window to watch the car drive away. That was a foolish mistake. As I looked at the car, I noticed it actually had a few people in it. The man wasn't alone. They must have seen us standing at the window because the car braked hard and reversed back into our driveway fast. My heart was racing. What could they want? I remember asking myself. We retreated back into our hiding spot and waited. The knocks were coming from all over now. The front door, the back door, and every window. I called my father again and he finally picked up. He told me to stay put and that he would be there in 20 minutes. After about 10 minutes, the noise stopped. We stayed still until my father arrived. By that time, the car was gone. My cousin and I explained to my father what happened. The handle on the front door was broken, so my dad called his friend, who was a cop. A few days later, my father told me that the police had found the culprits. They were just a group of young adults who wanted to prank one of their friends, but had the wrong address. The story seemed odd to me, since I know they had noticed us, and we were obviously just two little girls, but I didn't question him too much as I was raised to not question adults. My father did install a handy lock on my parents' bedroom closet afterwards, and told me and my siblings that, if we were ever in danger, to lock ourselves in there and hide. Thankfully, we never had to.
This is a story that was told to me by my mother. My mother grew in a really rough housing complex that consisted of 7 high-rise buildings. Buildings that all stood 12 stories high with 8 apartments on each floor. The place was huge and gained a really bad reputation over the years. At times it was so bad not even the police wanted to enter. My mother told me about one Friday night when she was about 16 years old. She and a group of friends from this housing complex decided to get together and all go to the movies. She says as they were settling down and the movie was about to begin, 2 of her friends, the Clint brothers, known for being very mischievous, found a purse that was empty except for a bottle of pills being inside. The Clint brothers, not knowing or understanding what the pills did or were, wanted to slip the pills into someone's drink or food to see what effects they would have on someone. Failing at trying to convince everyone in their group to take the pills, the Clint brothers decided to pour some of the pills into the soft drink of an unsuspecting friend in their group named Sydney. My mother explained how she told them that they better not, as she tried to snatch the pills but was unsuccessful. The Clint brothers replied, okay, we're not," at the same time winking at each other. As the movie starts and everyone focused on the screen, in the darkness of the theater, the Clint brothers crept up behind Sydney and poured most of the pills into her drink. After the movie, Sydney stated that she wasn't feeling so well and that she wanted to go straight home. At the same time, my mother noticed the Clint brothers were snickering at each other. She rushes over to them and whispered, "You guys didn't do what I think you did." They started laughing, replying, No, chill." But my mother had a feeling they were telling a lie. As the days and weeks went on, my mother said she noticed a drastic change in Sydney. She would be seen around the neighborhood talking to herself, behaving oddly, and doing strange things. It got to a point where Sydney's family took her to see doctors, but they couldn't find anything wrong. After a while, Sydney withdrew from everyone, no longer hanging with friends or socializing. Her family thought it would be best if someone would be with Sydney at all times, so they would take turns watching over her. One day, my mother ran into the Clint brothers in front of the housing complex where they all lived and confronted them, screaming, "What the fuck did you assholes do to my friend?" As everyone watched on, she screamed, "I know you gave her those fucking pills when we were at the movies. That's messed up." The Clint brothers just stood in shock as my mother continued to scream at them. The brothers replied, whispering, "Hey, Jay, come on, calm down. We didn't mean for things to go this far. We're sorry, for real." My mother said she was so pissed that she stormed off. The following day, Sydney is at home being cared for by her older brother when he tells her, "Hey, I'm gonna hop in the shower, you need anything?" Sydney replies, "Nope," and he tells her that he won't be long. Meanwhile, people from the housing complex are outside playing cards, kids are running around, some shooting hoops, when all of a sudden, there's this loud boom followed by the piercing scream of a woman. Everyone jumps up and runs towards the screams to see what's going on. Much to the horror of the onlookers, it was Sydney. She jumped 10 stories from her living room window, hitting the ground with such force it left a huge indent in the dirt beneath her body, shattering her jaw, leaving her teeth in a bloody pool around her head. My mother said as she rushes over to see what all the commotion was about, she was devastated to find her friend laying in the massive pool of blood, barely clinging to life and choking on her own blood as she tried moving her mouth as if she was attempting to speak. Sydney's brother gets out of the shower, looking for her, calling out her name. When he enters the living room, he notices their cat sitting in the window looking out at the ground. When he walked over to the window and looked out, he saw his little sister Sydney on the ground beneath their window, surrounded by people, and immediately started screaming. Sadly, she would die en route to the hospital. From what Mom tells me, the Clint brothers were questioned by the police in connection with Sydney's death, but with no one actually seeing them drug her and without any hard evidence, they were unable to bring them up on charges. Prior to the incident with Sydney, the Clint brothers already had a really bad reputation in the community for being very troublesome teens, as they would find stray cats and kittens from the neighborhood, take them to the roof of one of the 12-story buildings in the housing complex, and throw the cats from the roof of the building to the ground below. But karma is a bitch. The Clint brothers would later become heroin addicts, one eventually dying of a drug overdose and the other dying from AIDS due to sharing dirty heroin needles. It's been believed for decades within our community that the Clint brothers got away with murder.
This happened a year ago, in the summertime when I was around 14. I'd like to mention that I'm a female. It was around 11:15 at night, and I was taking the MAX train home from a rock concert with 3 friends and my girlfriend, Alexa. When we got off the MAX, we decided to be douchebags and did some ding-dong ditching. After being yelled at and hearing threats to call the cops, we decided to call it a night. Alexa and I said goodbye to our friends and headed to my house. On the way there, we cut through a park, and Alexa ran ahead of me and got on a swing. I joined her, and we sat on the swings for the next few minutes talking. As Alexa rambled about Teen Wolf, I looked around the empty park. I can remember thinking that it looked so gloomy and spooky, with the full moon just adding to it. As I looked around, I stopped at the tree line. Standing there was a small group of people. I couldn't make out any facial features, but I could tell that they all had on dark clothing, and that there were 3 of them. They were standing still, and were all staring in our direction. I didn't freak out just yet. My first thought was that they were smoking weed or something, and had just noticed us. But then my imagination ran wild, and told me that they were schizophrenic homeless people that were going to mug us. I brushed it off as me being too paranoid, and went back to my conversation with Alexa. 1 or 2 minutes later, I looked back in their direction. They were still standing there, except now they were talking. One of them pointed at us, and the other 2 nodded. After seeing that, I was done. Better safe than sorry. I told Alexa it was getting late, and we should probably head back to my place. She agreed, saying she was worn out and wanted to go to sleep. I didn't tell her about the group of people, because I didn't want to freak her out, especially if it was nothing. My house was less than 10 minutes away from the park. Once we got there, I made sure to lock the doors. Alexa and I were the only ones home, since my mum was at a bachelorette party, and my siblings were off doing whatever they were doing, and weren't coming back until the next day. Alexa and I went up to my room, and we fell asleep cuddling. I woke up a little bit later, and was immediately overwhelmed with a gut feeling that something was very wrong. I felt nothing but terror and anxiousness. I checked the time, 1:04 a.m. I'd been tired when I dozed off, so what had made me wake up so suddenly? Alexa was still asleep, so I didn't want to wake her. I texted my brothers and sisters to ask them if for some reason they'd come home early. They all replied with something along the lines of, "No, go to sleep, sis." I was starting to feel nauseous. Then I wondered if I was just getting sick or something. As if sensing my distress, Alexa opened her eyes and looked over at me. "Are you okay?" she whispered. "I don't know, Lex. Something's wrong. I feel it." She opened her mouth to say something back, but was cut off by a smashing sound coming from downstairs. We both looked at each other, confused. My first thought was, oh shit, did someone break in? And took out my aluminium baseball bat before going down to investigate. Once again, better safe than sorry. Alexa stayed in my room while I crept downstairs to the living room. Everything was dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw the basement door was fully open. Now I really started to panic. The basement door was always shut because we hardly went down there. I don't know if it was my imagination or not, but I could have sworn I heard a faint whispering and shuffling, as if someone was moving away from the basement stairs. As I stood there, every scene in a horror movie where the victim's looking for the source of the noise before being stabbed to death runs through my head. I decided I'd go back upstairs and call 911, but when I turned around, I nearly shit myself. Standing there was a woman, and she was just as startled as I was. She had on dark clothing, was in her early 20s at most, and was in a position as if she was trying to move quickly but quietly. I took in all of this in a few seconds before she charged me. I knew that all it would take is one good swing from my bat and she'd never get up again, but I didn't want to kill her. I dropped the bat and just start swinging my fists. Looking back, I should have just hit her with the bat. I was stupid not to do that. She was pretty short for her age, while I was pretty tall for mine. I easily towered over her at 6'1", but that was the only advantage I had. I ended up kicking out the back of her knee, and she was on the ground. I kicked her in every place I could reach, until I heard more than one person running up the basement stairs like an elephant. I looked behind me just in time to see two people barreling out of the basement. They too had on dark clothing. That's all I took in before I bolted. I ran up the stairs 3 steps at a time, as if my life depended on it, which it probably did. Alexa was outside of my bedroom door. She ran back inside and we shut the door, locked it, and pushed my dresser in front of it. The 3 people outside were kicking at the door and taunting us. I had dropped my phone downstairs while brawling with the woman, and Alexa didn't have a phone because it was broken and hadn't been replaced yet. So we quietly climbed out the window and onto the roof, jumped off, and bolted to the neighbor's house. There were 5 college kids living there, and although they were really noisy, they were really friendly as well. The lights in the house were on, so we knocked. One of the guys answered, and Alexa quickly explained our situation. He invited us in and called 911. The police arrived in about 5 minutes and searched the house, but the 3 people were gone and nothing was stolen. I mentioned the people that I'd seen at the park, and the cops decided to look there. They found all 3 of them in the park's bathroom. They were swiftly arrested. Turns out, they'd robbed a few other houses in the area. my mum and all of my siblings came home early. It's a year later, and my mum is still wary about leaving any of us home alone. On the bright side, Alexa and I have a cool story to tell.
Let me start off by telling you about my cat. We got him because someone dropped him off at our farm, and he is the sweetest little kitten I've ever met. He's really cuddly and has a bit of a hearing problem because of a blood clot in his ear. But don't worry, he's okay. He's a very smart cat, and is actually kind of protective. His name is Ozzy. The town I live in is pretty small, and we don't have a lot of crime here, so my parents didn't really make sure to lock the doors at night or any of that. That's probably why this guy thought to try and rob us. I woke up on that night because of my cat. He was standing right on my chest meowing very loudly. I thought it was extremely weird because he never meows. Not for food, not to go out, never. I automatically assumed he was sick because he does occasionally meow when he's going to throw up, so I started to take him downstairs so I could take him outside and let him get it out of his system. That's when I noticed the truck. There was a rusty blue pickup truck outside in our driveway. The lights were off. I found that odd too because if it was one of my parents' friends, they would be on, and they would probably be honking. I didn't recognize the truck either. I was starting to get the feeling that something was extremely wrong. I could hear the back door open. I knew it wasn't my parents because my mom never wakes up until at least 7. It was around 2:30. My dad was hunting somewhere in Pennsylvania, and my little brother was asleep. My cat stopped meowing now, and was slowly walking over to the stairs. I could tell he was trying to be quiet, and somewhere in my tired brain I had started to figure out that someone was in my house. I was starting to panic, but I didn't want to call 911 in case it was actually my mom letting out the dogs or something, even though it didn't sound like it. It was too quiet to be that, and I didn't hear the dogs fighting, so I decided to follow Ozzy to the stairs. Ozzy stopped as soon as he got to the top of the stairs. He was looking down and stopped meowing. I decided to slowly continue down the stairs, just to see if I was misunderstanding. I remember I went down the first couple of steps when I saw the man. He was standing in our living room with his back to me, wearing all black, holding something in his hand as he slowly crept towards the stairs. I shot backwards and grabbed the cat. I knew he heard me then, because he started to move a lot faster. He was at the bottom of the steps and now I could see he was holding a knife. I was fucking terrified. I was crying now, trying not to make noise because I didn't want to wake up my dogs or my mom and get them stabbed. I ran into my room, cat in hand, slammed the door, making sure it was locked. I was praying that the man wouldn't open my brother's room, which was right before mine, and was too focused on me instead. I grabbed my phone and called my dad, whispering tearfully that there was someone in the house and I loved him and to call the police. He was panicking now too, knowing a man with a knife was in his house with his wife and kids and he could do nothing about it. I told him to call the police again, and right as I hung up I heard the man open the door to my brother's room. I screamed, louder than I ever had in my life. I grabbed a hold of some little glass bird, flung open the door, and threw it right at the man. It hit him right in the face. I saw his eyes grow wide with anger, and I screamed again and slammed the door. I could hear my mom waking up downstairs and asking what was wrong, and I could hear the man running down the stairs, through the living room, out the door into his truck. I could hear him leave, and I could hear my brother screaming, and my mom running up the stairs, and then I fainted. The next morning, when we got to town to file a police report, we heard that the man had robbed an old woman. I knew it was him because it described his truck perfectly. It said he stabbed her, took all her jewelry, money, anything he could find, and fled. Thankfully she survived, but they still haven't found him. I hope that bastard rots in jail. I don't know why the man ran away. He could have easily killed me and my family and took everything we owned. Maybe he couldn't see well because of the glass in his eye, or maybe he thought other people had better stuff than us, or maybe he just felt wrong killing a 14-year-old child. I don't know. Whatever the reason, I'm thankful for it. I owe my life to my cat. It feels weird to say, but it's true. If he hadn't woken me up that night, my whole family could have died. The day after, as we were still recovering, I remember we went to the grocery store and bought him 2 whole bags of treats. He deserved it. I always lock the door before I go to bed now. I never really thought that kind of thing would happen to me, but I don't want to take any more chances. Better safe than sorry.
Let me start, as most storytellers do, with some short backstory. I live in a fairly safe and quiet town in the east coast of Scotland. Surrounding areas have a bit of a reputation for malfeasance. Our town, however, is quite wholesome. I often have trouble sleeping at night, and during the summer, in my country, I take late-night strolls, varying somewhere between 30 minutes to an hour long. As I said before, we live in a safe neighborhood, and in the few years I've done this, I've seldom bumped into anyone. Even if I have, there have never been any incidents worth regard. Until one night, last year. It was a Tuesday night in July. The atmosphere was what only can be described as muggy. For those unaware, this was a word normally used to describe a dull, thundery heat. It was unusually warm for nighttime. As usual, I was having trouble sleeping, so I jumped into a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, climbed into my slip-on shoes, and headed out the front door. Directly behind the street I live, there's a cycle path that you can walk almost through the whole town. I usually walk down this path through a tunnel, then would cut through some side streets to double back to my place. On this evening, it was about 1 a.m. with an area soul in sight. I walked through the tunnel as usual, and for whatever reason, I decided to carry on further up the wooded path rather than head home. I took about 10 steps after the tunnel when I felt an extreme discomfort emerge, right from the bottom of my gut. I scanned my surroundings, but it wasn't until I looked straight ahead. I saw him. There was a guy walking towards me in a gray hooded jumper, hood up, and matching sweatpants, with a massively exaggerated swagger. Oh great, a junkie, I thought to myself as I proceeded. I've lived around here far too long to feel threatened. After walking about 4 steps, he noticed me. At this point, he immediately dropped his swagger and put his hands into his hooded pockets, and started skipping in my direction. That's right, skipping. I've encountered a few ass clowns in my fairly safe neighborhood in my time, but never anything quite that unsettling. I continued walking slower at this point, until he skipped by me and I could get a look at his face. Except I couldn't, because he was wearing a pig mask. Now adequately freaked out, I just stared at him as he skipped, not even acknowledging my presence. He skipped to about 10 feet past me and fell flat on his face. A moment of light humor in an otherwise dark situation. He lay there, and I blankly stared for what felt like an hour, but couldn't have been any longer for a minute. He slowly stood up and turned his head skyward and shrieked loudly before turning and running towards me. I needed no second invitation to leg it. He chased me to a quiet retail park where, by some grace of God, a cop car was sitting. I barreled towards the car with the head case still in hot pursuit. 2 cops immediately dove out of the squad car and tackled the once skipping lunatic to the ground. He continued trying to get to me, even after he was lifted, letting out a deep and inhuman-sounding scream. The police radioed it in, and another car came to take me home. I was contacted by the police to be made aware that the man chasing me was a known drug abuser from one town over, and that he was admitted to a mental facility up the road. To be away for a very long time.
This happened about 3 years ago, and it's still one of the creepiest things that has ever happened to me. For background, I live in a city of just over 100,000 people. Not huge, but it has a lot of suburbs on the edge of town. I live near downtown, but my friend lived right in the middle of one of these suburbs. I was leaving her house at around 11:30 at night, and while I can't remember what day of the week it was, I remember not being terribly worried about running into anyone. From her house to mine was around 8 miles, and I was driving an e-bike, which is kind of like an electric moped that can only go about 20 miles per hour. Since the speed limit was usually 25 to 30 in the city, I was used to cars speeding around me. It was no big deal. Anyway, I leave her place and start driving home. The first half of the trip is uneventful, but as you get closer to downtown, the neighborhoods get rougher. Right around the halfway point, I'm parked at an intersection when I noticed a kind of beat up red Sunfire behind me. I thought it was a bit weird that they didn't pull up beside me, since cars at intersections usually did. I kept to the right side like any other cyclist would. But e-bikes were pretty new in my town at that point, so I figured they just didn't know how much space to give me. The lights change, I drive on, and it takes me another 2 blocks to realize that the car is not passing me. This is where I realized that things were weird. The car was trailing behind me only about 20 or 30 feet and was coasting at 20 miles per hour despite the fact that there were no other cars anywhere on the road, so overtaking me would be easy. It was weirding me out, but I figured they would get bored and move on eventually. A couple of miles later, I started heading into downtown, and sure enough, the car was still following me. I could only see them in my mirrors, but I could tell that there were at least 2 people in the car, so I was outnumbered too. I started to get worried as I get closer to home, realizing that I'm going to have to stop eventually, and wondering what will happen when I do. My house, despite being near downtown, was on a quiet street that barely got any traffic, and wasn't very well lit. As I'm approaching a yellow light, I decided to risk running it to leave them behind at the red light. I turn left, only to be greeted by another red light. Thinking quick, I turn right on the red, but I can hear the squealing of tires as the first light turns green, and the car circles around the block, the way I didn't go, to meet up with me. At this point, I'm facing the car on a side street, dead on. I have 2 choices: drive towards the car or turn left. The car isn't moving, instead waiting for me to make a decision. I turn left as it's the way towards my house, and the car calmly turns to follow behind me. At this point, I'm losing it. Even though it's cold and I'm shaking like mad, I take out my cell phone and call my boyfriend. I know I should have called the police, but I was freaking out. I tell him he had better get his ass outside of our place right now, because there's no way I'm stopping alone. At the same time, I'm describing the make and model of the car as best as I can, while also trying not to crash. When the people in the car realize that I'm on the phone, they decide to overtake me. As they do, I look over and see 2 men, rough looking, probably in their 30s. They're laughing their heads off, not in a what a fun joke way, but in a cruel way. Like they're going to get me, no matter what. It's absolutely terrifying. I figured that they thought I was calling the cops, so I start to calm down. They're still going pretty slow ahead of me, but at least they aren't following me anymore. As I'm coming up to the street that I live on, I make sure to wait until they're past the intersection before I put on my right blinker, and they put on theirs. I turn onto my street as their tires squeal again, turning onto the street 1 block up. I know that they can go faster than me, and I contemplate trying to find somewhere to hide. I decide against it, and sure enough, as I come up to the first intersection, their car is sitting perpendicular to me, waiting for me to pass by so that they can follow again. It seemed like it was some kind of hilarious, cruel game to them, watching me try to get away and knowing that they could always go faster. As we approached my house, I saw my boyfriend standing on the lawn, arms crossed and leering at the car. He wasn't good for much, but I'm glad as hell that he was there. I pulled into the driveway, and as the car was halfway into the driveway as well, they finally saw him. They were gone before I could even turn my bike off.
Let me give you some background on the situation. My name is John. I was 16 at the time of this event, and in the middle of my junior year. I'm from Asian descent, and am nearsighted, which means I can't see very far away, which is like a couple inches away from my face. It all started when I was in my homeroom. I'll call my teacher Mrs. H. Now, Mrs. H was a young woman in her 30s, but looked much older than she was. She taught history, and I have her for second period. First period just ended, and I'm getting into class. As I walk over to my seat, I see a skinny, black-haired kid sitting there. "Are you the new kid?" I asked. "Yeah, my name's Kyle." "Cool, name's John. I don't want to seem rude, but you're in my seat. Could you please move?" He gave me this face like a child makes when he doesn't get what they want. He got up and sat in the seat behind me. He reeked like someone who hadn't showered in a while. I took my seat and class begins. Mrs. H explains that there's a project we have to do, and it's on famous landmarks and their purposes. This was a partnered project, and lucky me, I was paired with Kyle. I remember thinking, not only was this going to give me a bad grade, but it meant that he had to come over to my house, or I had to go to his house. Obviously, I didn't want someone to just come over to my house, nor did I wish to go anywhere for that matter. So I made a stupid decision and decided to give Kyle my phone number. Everything was fine for the first couple of days. Nothing was creepy besides the look he gave to me a few days ago. Except for one afternoon where him and I were just finishing writing. We both did 2 pages each, and we were going to pick out the highlights from both of them and combine them together. This was a couple hours ago. My parents were now out at dinner, and I was home alone playing some computer games when I heard what sounded like glass shattering from my basement, which was odd because I was on the 2nd floor. Being the coward I am, I decided to pause my game and listen. Not sure what to expect, I sat listening for a good 5 minutes before resuming my game. Another minute goes by and I can hear the door to the basement open. The only pet we have is a cat that's on my bed at this time. I mute my computer and turn off the monitor, grabbing my phone to dial 911. This was on a landline installed in my room, which was also my dad's office sometimes. I quickly told the operator the situation, and she dispatched an officer. I hear silent footsteps up the stairs. It felt like it was taking forever, which was only roughly 3 minutes when I hear sirens. I never felt so safe in my room. That was until my door slammed open. The only thing visible was a mere silhouette of a figure. The sirens went past my window, emitting enough light for me to see the face of Kyle. He didn't notice me, but he hides in the closet parallel to me. I've never been so scared in my entire life. He was donning the same facial expression he had when I told him to move out of my seat. It was roughly 30 seconds of utter darkness besides the streetlights glaring in through the windows. The door slams open and the cops rush in, turning on my light and asking me if I'm okay. I scream my fucking lungs out and try to explain that he's in the closet while sobbing. The officer opens the closet and gets attacked by Kyle immediately, but luckily he tases Kyle. I ask the cops why they arrived so fast on only a suspicion, and their answer still sends shivers down my spine. They told me that the operator said that they heard another phone click after I hung up. Kyle was escorted out of my house and taken off to jail, and I handed in the school project a week later because I took some time from school and stayed at my grandparents' house. I got an A. Just a quick note, I recently noticed my Facebook had my phone number and my address on it. Needless to say, that's probably how he got my address, and without a doubt I took both of them off and set my profile to private.
The following event happened during summertime when I was 19 years old. It was Saturday afternoon and I was together with a group of friends, 3 girls and 2 guys. We were just hanging out, talking about drinking that evening at one of the guys' houses, Jacob. Jacob was a nice guy and a good friend of mine. We grew up together and he was always a quiet kid. He always had a lot of friends, but growing up he was spending most of his time by himself. Now in his late teens he was the opposite. He was more of a wild guy, partying a lot, drinking, and doing drugs occasionally. He said that we could do something scary that night at his house, something about rituals, ghosts, and demons. The girls responded by giggling and agreeing that it would be fun and exciting, not taking it very seriously, like most people. I just said that they shouldn't be messing around with stuff like that. By looking at him, you would never think he would do something like that, but I knew that he had gotten very interested in the occult, black magic, and satanic stuff lately. He had told me that while he was on vacation in Italy with his family earlier that spring, they went to a market where he found a book about black magic from the 1600s, written in Latin. He bought it for very little money and he tried to figure out what it said using the internet. He was also surfing on the deep web and had been receiving links to some websites about Satanism and ancient rituals. Not some of that LeVay stuff, but real devil and demonic spirit worship. He said he had found a lot of brutal stuff, like something about a teenage boy in India who did some demonic ritual and ended up slaying his whole family with a machete. I didn't know what to think about that, so I just laughed a little and told him he was crazy, and I didn't understand why he was so obsessed with that evil shit. But I didn't think too much of it. I didn't know if it was real or not. I never searched or have seen it. So they asked me if I was going to join them later, but I had been up since very early that morning. I was really tired and didn't feel like drinking, so I declined. After they tried to convince me to join anyways a few times, they accepted it. That night I just went to sleep pretty early. The next day, I talked to one of the girls, Jennifer, and I asked if they had a good time at Jacob's house. She told me that they had a great time. They all got really drunk and she was hungover. Then I remembered Jacob talked about that ritual crap that I thought he would do just to scare the girls, like when people play with those Ouija boards for thrills. So I asked if they did any of that. She said yes, and explained a bit of it. She said something about he had used salt to make a circle and symbols on the floor of the living room. They had candles, and he was doing some weird chants in another language. She just thought he was messing with them. So I couldn't help but laugh and ask if they talked to some demons or something. Even though I thought it sounded like he was very serious about that ritual, she said that nothing happened, and they just laughed about it, and continued to drink. A couple days later, the same girl asked me if I've talked to one of the other two girls, Christina. I told her that I haven't heard from her lately. She said that Christina had been acting a bit weird, and she didn't reply to her texts or calls. Since I lived in the same neighborhood as her, I said that I would go over to her house later and talk to her. Christina was also a good friend of mine. I also grew up with her. She had always been a sweet girl, very popular, beautiful, with green eyes and natural blonde hair. She was very smart and got good grades, and she was athletic. She had a very bright future ahead of her. I went over there, and it was true. She seemed a little weird. I asked her why she didn't answer her phone when it rang. She didn't really give me an answer to that. She then started telling me about weird dreams that she's been having. The night she came home from drinking at Jacob's house, she woke up in the middle of the night because she felt something burning on her stomach. Even when she was awake, she felt it. So she went into a panic, jumped out of the bed, and looked at her stomach. But there was nothing to see. I just told her that it was because she had too much to drink, but she said that she hasn't been sleeping well since. She described it as she was sleeping, but kind of was awake at the same time. She said it felt weird. She felt she was being watched all the time. I thought it was strange. She seemed different. She looked lost and scared, and she had a kind of empty look in her eyes, like if you looked a drug addict in the eyes. I was a bit worried, and I told her that she could call or text me any time of the night if she needed to. The following days, her behavior got more strange. She had been showing up at school, and after a few hours, she would randomly leave, leaving her book bag and her laptop behind. No one knew where she was or how to get a hold of her, because her phone was also left in the school. Her parents were worried and called the police, but that night she came home, looking more lost than ever. It was very confusing, because she wasn't doing any drugs, she had no mental illnesses, and there were no mental illnesses in her family. That night I talked on the phone with her, and she told me that she had been dreaming that she was covered in snakes, and when she woke up she still felt it, even though she was wide awake. It really freaked her out. The next weekend came and she wrote me Saturday evening if I could come over, so I did. As we talked, she started to cry and said she would sometimes feel like she was being bit, like being bit by a dog. And when she was younger, she was actually viciously bitten by a dog, so she knew what it felt like. She said it really felt like that, and it hurt, but there was nothing to see where she felt it. I hugged her and tried to calm her down, but I was starting to freak out. The next day, her parents and little brother were going to visit her grandparents. She wanted to stay home and have Jennifer come and stay the night with her because there was no school that Monday. Her parents left at about 2 p.m. and Christina was alone with her dog. Jennifer would get off work around 7 p.m. and be there about 30 minutes later. When Jennifer arrived, she was greeted by Christina's dog, but Christina wasn't there. She wasn't in her room and she wasn't answering when she called her name, so Jennifer looked around the house. She opened the door to the bathroom and saw something she will never forget. Christina was lying on the ground, lifeless in a pool of her own blood. The mirror was broken. She had stabbed herself in the stomach 6 times with a piece of the mirror and had cut her wrist so hard that she almost cut her entire hand off. The ambulance and police were called, but Christina was, sadly, long gone and couldn't be saved. It was shocking, and it still is. Jennifer had to talk to a psychiatrist and get some medication for anxiety afterwards, but she is okay now. She says that she could still smell that overwhelming scent of iron from all the blood. Throughout this short period of time, we heard nothing from Jacob. After I told him about Christina's issues, he never answered my texts or calls. He shortly after moved out of his parents' house into an apartment in another city. I heard that he was struggling with severe depression and was drinking heavily, but I couldn't get in contact with him. Someone told me that he, in a conversation over the phone with his mother, was crying and said that he hated himself. About 5 months later, his father came to visit him and found him dead on his bed. He had apparently been drinking so much that he had passed out, and while sleeping on his back, he threw up and suffocated on his own vomit. As you can imagine, this is all still very shocking and a complete mystery. There were many theories, such as Christina unknowingly suffered from some form of mental illness and all of a sudden went psychotic, but I personally don't believe that. Or that something really did happen at that ritual Jacob performed that night. That would explain why Jacob suddenly changed like that and moved away. I really don't know what to believe, and I don't think we will ever find out what actually happened. There are so many questions left unanswered. I think it is safe to say that whether you believe in stuff like that or not, you shouldn't mess around with something that is dark and evil in any shape or form. I don't think anything good can come from that at all.
Just to clarify, I'm a female in my early 20s now. This happened when I was 12 years old. I was in year 8. I'm guessing that is the same as 8th grade in America. Anyway, I was on my way home from school with my friend Kira. Kira was very small and had very childlike features. She was also extremely timid and easily scared. We decided to take a quick detour to the local supermarket for a drink and some snacks. Although this was frightening at the time, I am glad I made that detour, and you will understand why very soon. We got into the shop and went straight to the sweets aisle. It was fairly empty. There was only me, Kira, and a young Muslim girl who was staring at all variety of sweets. She was small like Kira, and like I said, Kira was small. If I had to put an age on this girl, I would say she was about 7 or 8. I couldn't see her parents, but just assumed they had told her to go choose some sweets and then return to them. I am a very observant person, naturally, and will instantly react if I see someone in danger, or figure out what to do if I notice anything suspicious. As we were browsing for sweets, I noticed out of the corner of my eye a man at the bottom of the aisle, staring. I ignored it for a moment, thinking he was checking what aisle he needed. But he stayed. He didn't move. I shot a glance over at him and tried to work out why he stood there. The man was also clearly a Muslim. I would say around the age of 30. For a second I figured he must have been her father. But then something didn't seem right. He was staring blankly at her. I turned to the little girl, and then back to the man. I did this several times, and with no doubt in my mind, I knew he was watching her. If he was with her, surely he would have just walked over and called out her name. He was not her father, her uncle, or her brother. I looked towards him again for a moment, and I could tell that his eyes were so fixated on her that he hadn't noticed me staring at him. I looked away as to not stare too long, but it was bothering me. I could see him out of the corner of my eye. I need to intervene, I thought silently. Kira had been talking continuously at this point, but somewhere in the conversation I had switched off. She tugged my arm and I turned to her. Something had to be done. This girl's parents were nowhere in sight, and I knew I was the only person who could potentially stop whatever sick ideas this man had for this girl. I looked back at the sweets, but kept the little girl in the corner of my eye as I told Kira to be quiet, and I explained what was going on. "Shit," she whispered. "What do we do?" I had been thinking while she panicked. Brave, but very naive 12-year-old me decided to go stand with the girl. "We're going to walk over to her. As we stand next to her, keep your eyes on the man and do not take them off of him, Kira. I'm going to ask her where her parents are." With that said, we walked towards the girl, one of us on either side of her. My heart was racing for fear of what his intentions were. I tend to get very angry when I'm afraid, and my fear was solely for this girl. I knelt down beside her and said, "Hello, where are your parents?" She looked at me puzzled. I realized now that we looked like the creeps, not him. I'm not sure. They told me to grab what I wanted and go and find them. I looked at her face. So sweet, so innocent. I replied, would it be okay if we helped you go find your parents? I didn't want her to go find them alone in case that man got her before they did. Yes, please, she replied. Kira never took her eyes off the creep the entire time I was speaking to the little girl. She said he looked angry and sort of confused at what was going on, and he walked away just before we took off to go find her parents. I took her hand and hurried her along as we searched a few aisles for her mother and father. It didn't take us long until we found them. I was relieved as she ran over to them and placed her treats in their trolley. Thank you, she said, and her parents looked at us with concern, so I approached them quickly to explain why she just thanked us. I told them that a man had been watching their daughter intensely for the past 5 minutes and that I was worried because I didn't see her parents. They thanked me many times before I left the shop. I remember how terrified the mother looked as I told her. She took my hand and thanked me again before we left. It's over, I thought. The little girl is safe, and now I'm glad I took that detour. Me and Kira left the shop, and Kira decided she didn't want to go home yet, so insisted I come with her to her friend's house. Not today. I really need to get home, otherwise my dad will start to worry. She nodded and set off in the opposite direction. I began walking home, alone. I felt strange. Something in my gut was telling me to turn around. I walked through the car park and past the usual shops, and then I turned. He was behind me, merely yards away. As soon as I caught his eyes, I turned around and picked up the pace. My heart was pounding. I was only 12. I knew I couldn't outrun a grown man, and I was too small to fight him. Think! I screamed in my head. I kept passing shop after shop. No one was around. It was roughly an hour after school ended by this point, and all of the school kids had been to the local shops and gone home, usually in large groups. The sweet shop, I thought to myself. At the top of the path I was on, inside the car park/supermarket complex, was a small sweet shop. Nearly all of the kids from school flocked there after school ended for their cheap sweets. I knew there was a security guard inside. He was always there. He watched out for kids stealing sweets. If I can get to that shop before it closes, I'll be safe, I thought. Yes, it closed early on school days, as the only customers were kids. I was hoping for dear life the shutters weren't down. I knew if it was closed, I didn't stand a chance. My route home was simple, but not so much if you're being chased. After I passed the shop, I had to turn right under a bridge, then climb large stone stairs to walk over the bridge, and then walk over a large hill to get home. I didn't stand a chance. Not to mention I had severe asthma that was made worse when I was panicked or nervous. I picked up pace as much as possible without running. I didn't want him to think that I was aware I was being followed. He was walking at a steady pace, but keeping his eyes glued on me. Suddenly, as I was about to reach the shop, I saw the security guard. He stepped out of the shop just as I reached it. I scurried over to him and told him everything that was going on. I told him what happened in the supermarket, and then that the guy had followed me. I felt my heart pounding as the man slowly creeped closer. I have about half a mile to walk. Please. He cut me off. He looked angry. Go now. Don't stop walking. I'll stop him and keep him here as long as I can. Don't look back. Just move as fast as you can. I ran around the corner and then heard the security guard yell at the man to stop. I then speed walked as fast as my legs could carry me over that bridge. His voice faded as I walked further, and I knew he wouldn't let him hurt me. I felt okay. That feeling in my stomach was gone. I was okay. I reached my home with no problem. I never told my dad or my grandparents, but like I say, I've always been more cautious, and even though I put myself at risk, I'm glad I was able to help that little girl. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you can stay up to date on all my future content. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you email it to urmaker6260@gmail.com. I want to give a huge thank you to everyone who helped me out in this collaboration. If you aren't subscribed to any of them, I highly recommend you go check out the links in the description and give them a look. I also want to give a special shout out to one of my friends, Sky High Steve, for the drone footage you saw in some of this video. He's actually a really good friend of mine in real life, and if you're into drone footage, make sure you go subscribe to his channel as well. Once again, I want to give a massive thank you to everyone who helped me out, and a huge thank you to all my supporters who have been asking for this. It took a little bit of time, but surprisingly we actually got this huge collaboration done. I hope you all have a great weekend, and I'll catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true.